Welcome to the Right Take Podcast, news, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Greetings, welcome again to the Right Take Podcast. I am your host, Mark Tapson. Today, I'm identifying as a pansexual African American. But that could change at any moment, because, gender is fluid or whatever, and presumably so is race. I have made up some preferred pronouns, which I expect you to memorize so that you don't misgender me. They are zig and zag. No, I'm kidding about all that woke nonsense. My pronouns are he and him, because I'm a male. When you're a male, your pronouns are he and him. End of story. Thanks for joining me here at the intersection of politics and culture. I love having storytellers on the show because even if our discussion ends up being only tangentially political, telling stories, influencing the culture, crafting compelling narratives to change hearts and minds, that's the conversation we need to be having on the right. That's what will lead to the kind of change we want to see as conservatives, not putting our trust and financial support behind the same old rhino politicians or counting on the ballot box, the process of which has been completely corrupted now. Storytelling is one of the unique qualities at the core of what it is to be human. Every day we are all of us both storytellers and audiences. Stories are how we define and understand ourselves as individuals, as communities, and as a culture. So the kinds of interviews, like the one I'll have today, or like I've had in previous episodes with screenwriters and novelists like Andrew Klavan, Brian Godawa, Michael Walsh, these are the kinds of discussions our side needs to have more of and to pay closer attention to. My guest coming up at The Right Take is a longtime filmmaker and friend of mine who is a conservative/libertarian working right in the belly of the Hollywood beast. He's been involved in a lot of fascinating projects, so please stay with us while I bring him on. And don't forget to like and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of these important talks that we're having here at the intersection of politics and culture. Don't touch that dial. I have a long history with my guest on the podcast today. I began working for him at least by the year 2000, maybe even 1999, not long after I moved to Los Angeles and well before I became a conservative. In fact, working with him was directly responsible for my political conversion. It might seem kind of counterintuitive or ironic or whatever that working in left-leaning Hollywood turned me into a right-wing nut job, but there you go. It changed my life dramatically and for the better, and I'm very grateful for it. Cyrus Nowrasteh is a longtime screenwriter, director, and producer. He's worked on numerous TV series and made-for-TV movies, including The Day Reagan Was Shot, the Spielberg miniseries Into the West, and the controversial docudrama The Path to 9/11. He's also directed the theatrical features The Stoning of Soraya M., The Young Messiah, which was produced by big-time producer Chris Columbus, and Infidel, among other films. Currently, he's developing a couple of limited series called American Icon and Unshakable, and also a feature film called Sarah's Oil. Very busy guy. Cyrus Nowrasteh, welcome to the Right Take Podcast.
Thanks, Mark. Good to talk to you.
Good to have you here. A lot to talk about, so let's just jump right in. You knew from early on that you wanted to pursue a screenwriting career, right? That's what you studied in college. What were the films that inspired you, that made you say, that's what I want to do?
Well, boy, it's hard to pinpoint. I mean, I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be involved with movies and television. And, for me, when people ask me, like, what are your favorite movies? I sort of have to break it down and think, well, what are my favorite movies? And I think the obvious answer is, which movies have I seen the most? When I remember distinctly going to the theater with my family to see Lawrence of Arabia, which was a pretty amazing spectacle for basically I was probably 5 at the time, 5 or 6. Anyway, I've seen, I'm a huge fan of many directors, mainly from the era I grew up in. That was David Lean. I loved the movies of John Huston, Sam Peckinpah, Elia Kazan, the guys who came out of TV like Sidney Lumet, John Frankenheimer, they were all sort of the hot filmmakers of the 60s and 70s, Billy Friedkin and others. So, I could rattle off their movies, but I bet many of your viewers know them or, can look them up. Those directors are very distinctive.
And after college, you pretty much moved right into writing steadily for a number of TV series. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the day Reagan was shot. So we can move forward to that, which I guess is in the year 2000, if I remember right. Was that a bit of a minefield for you politically? I know you were a Reagan fan. Was it tricky to try to get that movie made in Hollywood? I know that was well before Hollywood's current wokeness, but in which you could not get a film made about Reagan now. But was it a bit of a political minefield for you to try to make a film about Reagan at that time?
Well, it was tricky, but I wouldn't call it a minefield. It was a different, as you say, it was a different time. Sure, Hollywood has always kind of leaned left or leaned Democrat, but, and with Reagan, he was in retirement at the time. I think I think his Alzheimer's had been announced. I think there was a general feeling that this was sort of a sad a fate for him, for anyone. And I think his presidency was generally regarded as fairly successful, even in sort of the centrist or, center left, center right world, especially, but certainly never in the far left. But, I pitched it. One of the biggest problems people had with it was they say, oh, well, it's called The Day Reagan Was Shot, and we know he got shot, but we know he survived, so everybody knows the ending, so who cares? Well, that was sort of typical of Hollywood development folks who really know very little about drama. I mean, some of the best movies we've ever seen, we know the ending of it. Titanic, we know the ship's going down. When we went to see Passion of the Christ, we know, his fate on the cross. I think Hitchcock proved that sometimes knowing can be as suspenseful, if not more suspenseful, than not knowing. But we managed. I pitched it. Really what happened was I pitched it around town, and I had done the research and got rejected everywhere. And I don't think it was for political purposes. It was just, it just didn't fit what was going on at the time for a whole slew of reasons. So I wrote it on spec because I'd done all that research. I didn't want it to go to waste. So over the holidays, I wrote it on spec. Then all of a sudden it became one of the hottest scripts in town and everybody wanted to be involved.
What was the conservative reaction or response to The Day Reagan Was Shot? It was a bit mixed, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I mean, we had some members of the Reagan administration, especially, what's his name? Richard Allen, who, objected to things. But what that was really about was he wanted us to use his book and tell the story from his perspective because there were conversations, between parties about it. And then he kind of spread negative word on it. And Nancy Reagan was upset because that was obviously, for clear purposes, a horrible day in her life. And she wasn't interested in it being dramatized. But we did it anyway. I mean, I think a lot of people who are Reagan supporters really liked the movie. And it's, it's sort of grace under pressure, exemplified by a sitting president, okay, who's just been shot. I think that's pretty heroic stuff. And I'd say even people who didn't like Reagan or didn't vote for him, who saw the movie, said, boy, you got to hand it to the guy. He had a sense of humor while he's being wheeled into surgery to have a bullet taken out that's a half inch from his heart. So,
and I remember that he commented to the surgeons that he hoped they were conservative.
Yeah, no, he goes, I hope you guys are Republicans. And they said, one of the doctors said, Mr. President, today we're all Republicans. And, that was the spirit sort of the time, as contentious as politics were back then. Today, I don't think you use the word contentious. It's just, they're at each other's, throats. It's really, they're at war. And I couldn't imagine someone saying that today. Can you imagine if someone would say that if President Trump, or President Bush had gone through the same thing? I don't know.
Oh my gosh, no. Well, speaking of contentious, let's move on to the ABC miniseries The Path to 9/11, which you wrote. That told the story of the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. And, I bet a lot of people, if not most people, born after 93, and maybe even a lot of people born before that, aren't even aware that the World Trade Center was the target of an Islamic attack in 1993. But anyway, the miniseries started with that World Trade Center bombing and depicted the 8 years after that, which led up to the 9/11 attacks. The making of that series and the controversy it ignited it's a big story to sum up. And I've talked a little bit about it before on the podcast, but as time goes on, I think fewer and fewer people remember that controversy. And I think that's what Disney and ABC are counting on, because they've done everything since the show aired to simply make it disappear. How did that project begin? And what was the attitude about it at ABC prior to the miniseries becoming controversial?
Well, Mark, you were very much involved in and a part of the path to 9/11. So, we've got sort of what's the line from Oliver Stone's movie? We've got scar tissue on our soul from that experience. And, basically it started the normal fashion. I was a working writer in Hollywood, and I got contacted by my agent, who said that ABC is interested in doing an adaptation of the 9/11 Commission report, which had come out and became an instant bestseller. Now, of course, the 9/11 Commission report is public domain. So sure enough, there was another network that was doing the same thing. And they asked me if I was interested. I went in and met with ABC. I was very interested in doing it. And that was the launching point for, in a strange way, was a perfect storm in my career, in both a good way and a bad way. The good way was I was able to launch in and basically write the miniseries I wanted to write. And because we were in competition with another network, there wasn't a lot of time to futz with it. As you know, networks and executives and producers and everybody else likes to mess with a writer's work, especially, in television, and especially when it's an expensive miniseries like this is. But we didn't have time for that. So I literally was writing this thing, and we're going into pre-production. And, we won the race. We shut down the other network. They spent $40 million and basically shot what I wrote. That was a perfect storm. And then, of course, the negatives that happened afterwards were a perfect storm. But, ABC was behind the miniseries. Anne Sweeney of Disney, the parent company of ABC, said it was one of the finest things she felt that Disney had ever been associated with. This is before broadcast. And, there was all kinds of enthusiasm and support.
But then what happened that turned that around? Even before it aired, there was something that happened that turned that, completely on its head.
Well, we had a screening, in hindsight, stupidly, but we had a screening at the National Press Club. I think it was 3 weeks. No, it was, about 3 weeks before broadcast. There were 1,200 people there. I was there, as was executive producer Mark Platt. And we only had time to show the first half because it's a 2-night miniseries, and nobody's going to sit in an evening in Washington, D.C. There was a dinner and there was a cocktail party beforehand, and So we could only watch night one. And night one dramatized the sort of mistakes and miscues of the Clinton administration. And night two, as you well know, shows the mistakes of the Bush administration. But there were a lot of partisan people there that night who objected and raised a big ruckus. It became a pretty hostile atmosphere for yours truly. And they were asking questions and they're saying, "Oh, this is bias. This is this. This is that." And they were all political animals. I mean, literally, there were Clintonistas at a series of tables. Among them, Richard Benveniste, who's the Clintons' attorney. So that night, they decided to launch a campaign to try and stop the Path to 9/11 from airing, which would have been 3 weeks later. So that was like around August 20, I guess. And then it was supposed to air September, I think 10th and 11th, or 11th and 12th, I forget. But they launched a campaign to stop it from airing altogether, and they nearly succeeded. But they did manage to convince Disney and ABC to cut 3 critical minutes from it. The controversy that erupted was focused on me and my supposed political proclivities and bias. And then it also focused on Disney and ABC, and they really felt the heat. So instead of caving completely and stopping it from broadcasting, they cut those 3 minutes.
I remember being stunned at the time by that internet campaign and the media campaign against it and the smears that you and director David Cunningham were part of a right-wing cabal of conservatives who somehow fiendishly managed to get a $40 million miniseries greenlit at a major studio. And you and David actually were receiving death threats over this, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. The panic. I mean, I think MoveOn.org was behind a lot of it. There were some other sort of far left groups. I mean, there's a book I think it's called Clinton in Exile, which has a whole chapter on this. It basically says that a group of these far left, interest groups got together and decided to launch this campaign to the point where at one stage they shut down the phone system into Disney. And everybody at Disney and ABC was really in panic mode. And, when you go through something like that, and everybody's sort of fired up, people do stupid things. And some people do intentionally target you. And I got a lot of death threats. The phone didn't stop ringing at my house for days. We stopped picking it up when we didn't recognize the number because a lot of them were just foul, threatening calls. One phone rang in my one of my son's rooms. Now, I don't want to give the impression they were, tiny tots or infants. They were they were actually off to college at this time, but they still had their phone. They had a phone in the back, and I picked up the phone. I just couldn't help myself, and a woman said, "Is this Cyrus?" And her voice was trembling. And I said, "Yes. How can I help you?" And she said, long pause, "How could you?" And I said, "How could I what? Make this miniseries with all these lies?" Well, of course, it hadn't aired yet. She's going on a campaign that's designed to outrage and have people make calls just like this. To condemn someone about something they don't know anything about. And I asked her, "Have you seen it?" And she goes, "I don't have to." And I said, "Yes, you do." And I hung up on her. So, people were just sort of riled up for no reason. But hey, this has become standard operating procedure years later. I maintain, Mark, that if social networks had been as active in 2006 when this happened with Path to 9/11, were as active as they are today, my career would have unquestionably been destroyed.
Yeah, that whole controversy opened my eyes so much politically that it literally set me on the path to turning me conservative. That was really kind of the turning point. That whole fascinating, outrageous story is captured in what I recommend highly to people. It's a riveting documentary from Citizens United called Blocking the Path to 9/11, which really sums up the whole amazing story. How does a filmmaker legitimately, or we'll say faithfully, dramatize an historical event like you did in The Path to 9/11 in a way that captures the truth, even if you have to sort of, shall we say, massage the facts?
Well, it's hard. I mean, in Path to 9/11, it was the sheer challenge of reducing about 8 hours or 8 years of history into a 2-night miniseries, which I think was about 5.5, 6 hours in total. So it comes down to, okay, what do you choose to include and what do you have to leave out? Well, you have to leave out most of it. So you're basically telling the highlights of what happened in those years between 93 and 2001, the 2 attacks on the World Trade Center. So it's just a lot of it's now, okay, I have to highlight it and I have to focus on a certain thread, which means I have to leave out a lot of other stuff. And then in order to make that thread sort of a narrative that makes sense, you have to fill in gaps and connect dots. And a lot of times that's where the fictionalizing has to come in. It's not as if you're recreating any facts from the time as much as you're working with the facts, but having to connect them with fiction. And, a lot of times, I mean, there's some people who said this, that when you're really seeking the truth, sometimes it's not about each incident or each line of dialogue being exactly as it happened. If anything, you will confuse or bore people if you do that. You have to highlight and accentuate and make it a kind of, for lack of a better term, entertaining narrative so that people will stay with you. And when you consider all the hoops that one has to jump through to get anything made in Hollywood, it's amazing that The Path to 9/11 was as accurate as it was.
Let's jump ahead a little bit to the stoning of Soraya M., which came out in 2009. And again, that was based on a true story also. And again, it was controversial because you were shining a spotlight on a dark side of Islamic culture, which is the stoning to death of women who were deemed guilty of adultery. It starred the amazing Jim Caviezel, who, of course, played Jesus in Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. Talk about that a little bit, that film.
Well, the book, The Stoning of Soraya M., was written by a French-Iranian journalist who's played in the movie by Jim Caviezel. And the book was published in the States, I think, in 95. And I read it. And my wife, Betsy, who's also a screenwriter, I think she'd had her first movie that she'd written, produced that year, that starred Charlie Sheen. This is back when he was a movie star. And we read Stoning Soraya M., and we thought, wow, this is a powerful story about a great injustice. And of course, my family, being Iranian, I was drawn to it for those reasons, because I felt that the Islamic Republic had turned Iran into this sort of, Neanderthal state. And I'd been to Iran. I'd lived in Iran. I knew what Iran was like. And not that it was paradise under the Shah, but by this time, by the mid and late 90s, everyone knew, oh gosh, these Ayatollahs are ruining this place and killing people and imprisoning people and bringing back these barbaric punishments like stoning. So from that point on, I wanted to make a movie of it, but I just thought, well, it's a fantasy. Then in 2005, when Betsy and I went to Morocco because we were shooting The Path to 9/11 there, the big question about doing any movie that's set in Iran, but critical of the Islamic Republic of Iran, where do you film it? But we realized quickly, hey, in Morocco, you could shoot it. You could, you'd have to do some production design, art and design work, but you could do it in Morocco. So we started talking about it again. And by that time, it had been years since Betsy had written any scripts. And I was trying to get her back into writing. So I said, okay, let's go after it. And honestly, I had no belief or even faith that anybody would make a movie of the stoning of Soraya M. But I decided to go after it anyway. It took me 2 years to get the rights. We got the rights, wrote the script, and a miracle happened. The movie got made. Not only did it get made, but it came together quicker than anything I'd ever been associated with. So it just goes to show, William Goldman was right. In Hollywood, nobody knows anything. And I think it's a movie I'm very proud of. We won numerous awards. It played internationally. It was controversial. It got a very small art house release here in the States because it was a pretty graphic depiction of the stoning in the movie. So it got a stiff rating. Also, most of it was subtitled. And at that time, people weren't as groovy with subtitles as they are now. But I remain very proud of the movie. And it's one I'm probably most known by even people in Hollywood, at least as a director.
And let's talk a little bit about that explicit depiction of the stoning. I think a lot of left-leaning critics weren't pleased by you bringing up the whole issue of stoning. And so they tried to dismiss the film as sensationalistic. I remember one critic even called it torture porn. And this was the same critic, by the way, who praised the whole Saw series of horror flicks, which are literally torture porn. Why did you choose to depict the stoning the way that you did? And what's your response to the criticism that it's sensationalizing it?
Well, there were some sort of loud, grotesque voices that said that, most notably the New York Times. But we also got a lot of great reviews and got a lot of awards. But, so you're not going to please everybody. But the bottom line is, to accuse someone of sensationalizing what is the most horrific and barbaric punishments that mankind could devise is and for drawing attention to it when no movie had ever been done about the subject is pretty amazing when you really think about it. It's like, really? They're upset because I'm making a movie that I'm upset about women are being stoned to death? And it just goes to show that, and even among what I would describe as feminists, people who describe themselves as feminists, we had difficulty getting them to support the film, if at all, because they were more concerned about the cultural, I guess, stigma of criticizing Islam or criticizing the practices of another country. It was pretty eye-opening. What's amazing, though, is, as you know, there was a big piece released by a European website just last week in line with the women-led revolution, current revolution in Iran. And a lot of people have contacted me, and a lot of people contacted me regarding Infidel as well, which came out in 2020 and is now available, on pay-per-view and streaming, where a lot of people who were sort of reluctant to talk to me about that, I was saying, wow, you were really on top of it. It was really bold, but boy, it's so true. Isn't this the way it is now in Iran? It's like now they're experts. But when I originally brought this to a TED People's in 2009 and then in 2020 with Infidel, I was kind of accused of being a little extreme.
It's an amazing film. It really is. There's a lot more that could be said about it, but I'm going to have to move ahead because you worked on so many good projects that I want to talk about. So let's move ahead to 2016 when The Young Messiah came out about Jesus as a child. You'd written an op-ed for Fox News called "How I Came to Make a Bible Movie." How did you come to make that Bible movie? Because you weren't even a believer at that point, were you?
No, I mean, I was kind of slow in coming to Christ. I would say I was pretty far along, but sort of hadn't crossed officially yet. What I had found, even going back to the day Reagan was shot, was that Christians seemed to respond to my work, you know. And we found that even with Stoning of Sir I Am, it was released in all the artsy sort of liberal centers like San Francisco and New York and the Laemmle theaters in Los Angeles. And what we found was, the theaters in Denver and the theaters in Phoenix, that's where people are going to see the Stoning of Sir I Am. They're Christians. So I knew that Christians had been responding to my work for years, and I was grateful for that. And then after this, when the Stoning of Sir I Am came out, Anne Rice, the author, notorious for vampire novels, wrote a rave review of the Stoning of Sir I Am. She was not hesitant to praise what the movie was about, unlike a lot of other women, famous women at the time. And so Anne boldly spoke out and then sent us a copy of her book, which was originally titled Christ the Lord. And she said, "You ought to make this into a movie." Well, our response was, "Gee, we're really flattered, but we can't afford an Anne Rice novel, and this is a big, expensive movie, et cetera, et cetera." She goes, "Oh, you don't need to option it. Just run with it. See what happens." I don't know how many best-selling authors will tell you that. So I made my first phone call was to a very prominent producer who'd done a very prominent Jesus movie, and he goes, "Oh boy, I don't want to do another Jesus movie." And he's a very Christian guy, but he said, you got to be careful. He goes, "People are going to attack it, no matter what." And I said, okay. So my second phone call was to Chris Columbus, who was a producer who I'd done some work for, some rewrite work for as a screenwriter. And by that time, Betsy and I had a script, and we showed it to him, and Chris was all in. And Chris, we got a deal with Focus Features, which is part of Universal, and the movie got made. It was another miracle, and it's part of what sort of brought me to Christ. And I actually got baptized, and it's been amazing. It's been an amazing journey on that movie, because it's still, I think it's into its fourth year on the queue at Netflix, because people are really watching it. I mean, when it came out, it was kind of dumped on the market because a new administration had come in and Focus Features. So we didn't get the theatrical play that we wanted, but it's done very well on streaming and in playing. And so I think we're going into our fourth year on Netflix. And after, every Christmas, every Easter, people are really watching it.
And speaking of Jesus, you worked again with Jim Caviezel on the very well-received thriller Infidel, which you mentioned. It was number one at the box office when it came out in 2020. That movie is not based on, or at least not based on, one true incident. It's more of a composite of true stories. Talk a little bit about Infidel and how that came about.
I didn't like referencing it as a true story or even inspired by a true story. That was a marketing decision. Okay. Now, I did research actual, shall we say, kidnappings and trials of Americans who'd been spirited into prisons in Iran. Unfortunately, there were numerous instances of this. So I had plenty to draw from. And what I did was I sort of took pieces of some of these different actual cases and fashioned a fictional narrative around it. And Jim Caviezel came aboard to play this guy who ends up in prison in Iran on trial for his life, and his wife travels there to see if she can plead for his life. And it really plays probably more like a genre thriller than anything I've done, and I'm really proud of that. and it's kind of a crowd pleaser. People really responded to it. It came out in the middle of the pandemic. Of course, theaters in California and New York were still closed at the time, but hey, there's 48 other states, so we opened strong, and I'm very happy for that.
Where did you film Infidel?
Infidel was filmed in Amman, Jordan, which doubled for Tehran, Lebanon, Egypt, and Washington, D.C.
And I bet the Iranian regime wasn't thrilled about this movie either, just like they were not thrilled about the stoning of Soraya M.
You're absolutely right. We had hoped they weren't going to find out because we were trying to keep it on the low that I was back in Jordan making another movie critical of Iran now. And so they knew very well about the stoning of Soraya M. In fact, they made it a crime to have a copy or own a copy of the stoning of Soraya M in Iran. So they were very aware of me. We tried to keep it quiet. We failed. They found out about it. They voiced their objections. We had good security on the movie, and the government of Jordan keeps a pretty close eye on the Iranian embassy.
Yeah. Another one that is likely to displease the Iranian mullahs is this limited series Unshakable that you're working on. What is that project about?
This is an amazing project, Mark. It is the true story of Saeed Mollai, who is the 2018 world champion of judo. Judo is a big sport in Iran. And Saeed literally became a national hero in Iran after winning the world championships of judo. And what people didn't know was that in the course of his journeys on the judo tour, his best friend was an Israeli competitor who he'd never faced. At the 2019 World Championships, he was in the semifinals and against an opponent. Saeed Mollai was against an opponent who he'd routinely beaten before. And he was ordered by the Iranian regime to throw the match because they were upset that if he wins, he would face the Israeli Sagi Muki in the finals. And Iran did not want to acknowledge Israel as a player on the world stage, so they didn't want their judo champion facing off against the Israeli in the finals. Their champion, Saeed Mollai, said, "I don't compete to lose." And he said, basically told them to go to heck. And but on his way out to the mat, he was pulled aside by our IRGC Iranian security, who handed him a cell phone. On the other end of the cell phone was his family in Tehran, who promptly told him that, Iranian police and security were in their house with guns. So effectively, they were telling him they were going to, imprison or harm his family if he didn't do as they say. So he then threw the match, which was devastating for him. Afterwards, this match was in Tokyo. He disappeared, and he went to the Judo Federation and asked for asylum, and he defected. So he ends up in Germany under house security because they know, and he knows, that the Iranian regime is trying to hunt him down and either bring him back for trial or kill him. So he's now in hiding, can't really train. His goal was to go to the Olympics, be a medalist at the Olympics. Well, now he can't compete for Iran. So what does he do? So what eventually happened was, because the Olympics got pushed to 21, the Mongolian team sort of recruited him because they had an Iranian coach who was also in exile. And he competed in the 21 Olympics and won the silver medal. So it's actually it's sort of a marriage of Rocky with the Bourne Identity. I mean, he has to hide out and he has to go through all of these measures to basically stay safe and compete.
Are you going to be directing that or just writing?
I'm the showrunner. I'm writing all 6. It's a limited series with MGM TV, Nat Geo, and Disney Plus. I mean, actually, I think Alex Gibney may direct the pilot. But, look, we're in the development stage now. You know the business, Mark. There's never any guarantees that something's going to get made and broadcast. But there's a lot of heat behind this project right now, especially because of what's going on in Iran.
It takes a lot of courage, not just from a career perspective, but in terms of your personal safety to take on some of these politically charged projects like Stoning of Soraya M. and Infidel and Unshakable. What drives you to embrace stories like these when you could very easily be working instead on Hollywood's latest fluffy reboot or a superhero flick?
Well, the superhero guys haven't called me yet. I'd be tempted, mainly because of the paycheck. But I consider myself very fortunate, Mark. I'm able to work on things that interest me. And I've managed to survive nearly 4 decades in Hollywood. And have, sort of gravitated, I'd say probably in the last 20 years, to basically working on things and being able to get paid for it that are my passions, my interests. And that's a blessing. That's a blessing from God. It really is. And, you take the heat. And I think that, let's just put it this way. When I'm in certain parts of the world, one has to be more careful. And now, look, I'm in the good old USA, and I'm a proud American, and I don't worry so much here. Even if some political animal who happens to be an American is calling me and threatening me, I call them keyboard cowards. They never really do anything. So it's just that when you're overseas, you're dealing with a different animal, a different kind of opposition. And so, especially when I'm in the Middle East, I travel carefully.
I seem to remember about a year ago, maybe a little more, I saw that you and Drew Klavan were teaming up on a series of Bible stories called The Covenant. Now, I know lots of the listeners are almost certainly familiar with that crowdfunded series about Jesus called The Chosen. Are these the same producers behind The Covenant that were behind The Chosen? And also, what is the status on that series?
Well, I think one of the persons involved with The Covenant was also involved with The Chosen, but is no longer involved with The Chosen. We were able to develop a script that Drew Klavan wrote, which honestly, I think is one of the best scripts I've ever read. It's an amazing pilot and script. The goal of the series was basically to do stories from the Old Testament. And I thought it was a great idea. We scouted. It came very close to getting made. And then a horrible thing happened. One of the key people involved in setting up the show passed away. And he was a great guy. And he was really the engine behind the thing. But I know for a fact they're still trying to sort of resurrect this project and get it going. And I'm hoping and praying for the best.
Yeah, it seems like with the success of The Chosen that this would, doing something similar with the Old Testament would be a no-brainer.
Well, yeah, no, I agree. It's just, let's face it, movies and television shows are expensive. They're risky. Even when it's a no-brainer, they're risky. and The Chosen caught a prairie fire. My hat's off to Dallas. I just think he's done a great job. I met him years ago.
You're talking about Dallas Jenkins, right?
Yeah, Dallas Jenkins, who's the creator of the show. And principal writer and director of the show. And, you got to give them so much credit for what they've accomplished. But I really think the brilliant piece of the show, and you have to credit Dallas for this, is the casting of Jonathan Roumie as Jesus. I think he's the show. I mean, he is so good. He's such a fine actor. And he gives off that feeling, I don't know, of warmth and embrace. He's a smiling Jesus. You know what I mean? And I think it's an incredible portrayal. I really do.
What's difficult? What's probably the most difficult thing about doing a Jesus film? You mentioned the casting made all the difference in The Chosen. Is that true probably of every Jesus film you could think of? Another one that I'm thinking of is the one with Joseph Fiennes about the centurion who...
Right. Risen.
Yes, Risen. That seemed to be another example where the casting of Jesus seemed to make all the difference. But what would be... does it come down with the casting of Jesus? Is that really what helps make a film about?
Well, I think that I think that's a big part of it. I also think that you can't really mess with the canon. We were accused of that on The Young Messiah because we're depicting Jesus as a 7-year-old, and there's no descriptions or chapters in the Bible about Jesus as a 7-year-old. So we got a lot of flack for that, even though our portrayal was as respectful and reverential as you could imagine. But Pat Robertson said to me, "You're going where angels fear to tread, young man." And, after being shocked that he called me a young man, I got his message. So he was right. But like I said, people have fallen in love with The Young Messiah on streaming, and I got like 2 emails about it this morning from people who watch it. I still hear from people all the time. So it's just you do the work you want to do. You thank God that you're able to do it, and then you just pray and hope that people will see it and respond to it. You can't control
it. You had to cast Jesus as a child, which must have been pretty challenging. What was that like?
It was very challenging. First of all, there aren't a lot of 7 or 8-year-olds who can act. They don't have agents. You have to basically put out a search, a widespread search. Our search encompassed planet Earth. And what we did was I had casting directors all over, in Israel, in Italy, in London, in New York, in LA. We put out this casting call, and usually people would send in, they'd send in a tape of their child. So we saw, if you accumulate all of these tapes that were sent, we saw over 2,000 young boys to portray Jesus. And there was only one who could do it. And I mean that. It isn't that, we cast one. No, there was only one child who could do it. I didn't have a backup. And we found young Adam Graves O'Neill, who lives outside of London, and a remarkable boy. He's now a young man, really. And he was great.
I know that you know very well that it is a mistake to hammer too hard on political messaging in a film or TV show, or any kind of messaging for that matter, in a story. In storytelling terms, how do you get across to the audience the values and the virtues and the message that you want to convey in a way that seduces an audience rather than hits them over the head?
Well, I've been accused of hitting them over the head. But I don't think, I guess, it's hard to be objective about your own work and how you apply it. But I try to be, first and foremost, entertaining and take the viewer on a ride, just take them into a good story. and try to just, get everyone invested in our hero or heroes, and say, gee, I want to go with this guy. I want to see what happens, see what he did, see where he went, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes you tread into territory that people are very, very touchy about. And as you know very well, because you were there, 9/11 is a touchy subject. And there were a lot of mistakes made by both sides of the political aisle, but there was also efforts to sort of conceal those mistakes. Those people who I think wanted to bury the history and conceal what they'd done, the choices they made, the opportunities they had to stop bin Laden and Al Qaeda from hitting the towers, they rose up in arms because the Path to 9/11 miniseries basically highlighted those, because that's what it was about. So, when they rise up and sort of object en masse and are very shrill about it, you've touched a nerve and are probably onto the truth. I mean, we've seen it in recent years with a lot of this cancel culture and a lot of the attempts to sort of deny people the ability to question choices that have been made by the government, by whoever, the CDC or the NIH or whoever, that, okay, if they're trying to suppress that, maybe they're onto something. I think that's how people should think from here on. But that's a long-winded answer to your question, Mark. Basically, I just try to tell a good story.
Well, I think there's a lesson there for conservative culture creators. People are storytelling and story listening animals, and you're a storyteller. I often talk about how storytelling and not politics is what's going to save us as a culture and even as a civilization. Is it too grandiose or pretentious to talk about it like that in those terms?
Not at all. I think that, we're kind of at a crisis point in terms of entertainment, because all we're getting, although, there are messages in these movies, but we're getting a lot of franchise comic book stuff, and we're just getting a lot of things. And when people are trying to do movies that have a little bit more import to them, a little more substance to them, I don't think the studios or even the networks know how to market them anymore. And I think they're sort of getting lost. I mean, there are some that shine through still. I mean, I just love 13 Lives, the Ron Howard movie, which is, you could call that a docudrama. And, I do think stories are at the heart of sort of presenting, values and virtues to an audience of people making, critical choices in a story framework in their lives, and hopefully having a moral compass, as they said, about doing so, and that an audience is sort of enriched by that and invigorated. It's important.
I think that's probably a great note to end on. Cy, what's the best way for people to keep up with your projects and what you're doing? Where should they go?
Well, wow, that's a good question. I mean, I am on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram. I don't know how much longer I'll be, but no, there is a site. I have a site, cyrusnowrasteh.com. Unfortunately, I don't get to it as often as I'd like to revise it, but it is pretty up to date. I'm fairly accessible. When people want to find me, they find me. And sometimes people who I don't want to find me. So it's just, it's so hard these days, Mark, to sort of say, hey, I got this movie going. I'm going to start shooting on X. It's going to be out next year on this date. It's because you can't. I've had movies. I've got a project right now that was greenlit twice. That I think is now greenlit for the third time, and I think it's going to get made. But it's just hard to pump this stuff out until it's really done. and you have a date as to when it's going to come out.
Good stuff. That's all great stuff. Cyrus Nowrasteh, thanks for sharing your insights with us on the Right Take podcast. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, Mark. You too.
The Right Take with Mark Tapson is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.